Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. You are joining our webinar on Sweden's Road to Recovery, a conversation with Max Elger. I am delighted to welcome Max here. He is Sweden's State Secretary to the Minister for Finance, which he has been since 2014. Also, economist, which I like to see in my guests. What we'll be talking about today is Sweden's experience over the past year or so dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the current state of its economy, the public health situation to some extent, plans going forward, how to phase out measures that have been put in place to deal with the economic consequences of the crisis, and the future of both Swedish and European economic policy. Lots of things to talk about, and so I think we should get started with that. Max, thank you again for joining. I think the first thing we should talk about, and this is something that received really a tremendous amount of attention in the United States, is that Sweden adopted what was generally portrayed as a fairly heterodox approach to the COVID-19 crisis in the spring and early summer last year. Can you talk about that from the perspective of the Swedish government a bit? How do those policies look in retrospect? Have there been adjustments? Lessons to be learned, et cetera? I think that's a good place to kick off our discussion.
Well, thanks, Dan. And yes, I've come to realize over the past year that any Swede appearing internationally is expected to be a sort of epidemiologist of sorts. I'm not, but I'd be happy to kick off there. But I figured I'll start with an introduction. I'll start with the public health strategy. I'll be brief because it's really not my home turf. But then I figured I could say something about the way we've tried to bridge the crisis, and maybe something about how we're looking at going forward. So if that's okay with you, I'll
Wonderful.
I'll start like that. So thanks for the invitation. Well, I have come to realize that all Swedes are expected to know something about public health policy, seeing that there is the conception that the Swedish epidemic strategy was vastly different from the rest of the world. Now,
the way I like to think about it too is that all other fields of knowledge are ultimately subfields of economics, and so you are very well qualified to talk about this.
Well, thanks a lot. I think that in fact I have a slightly different view as to what has been the public notion at least a year ago. I think many seem to believe that we've had a sort of different aim for our public health strategy, or maybe different methods. I think that at least in a European context, I mean, all countries have tried to contain the spread of the virus. And one of the reasons to do that was to ensure that our healthcare systems could cope with the evolving situation. And in this respect, Sweden has really not been different than any other European country. Now, a year ago, it was very uncertain how long this pandemic situation would last. And in Sweden, we tried to put fairly strong emphasis on creating policies that we could maintain sustainably over time. Therefore, we didn't choose to apply a strict lockdown like many other European countries, but instead we relied on a fairly vast range of public recommendations, some legal measures in order to contain the spread of the virus. Now, I think if you look at the situation 1 year later and try to understand what went on, looking at, for instance, mobility data, Sweden really looks like most European countries during the last year. The aims were the same. So I think that Sweden's reputation as a policy outlier here is really exaggerated. We may have differed somewhat in methods, but I think that the gist of the policy was really fairly middle of the road European pandemic policy.
And would you say that to the extent that there were stark differences, that was really a matter of the first few weeks, and arguably other countries have also, there's been a process of convergence to some extent?
I think so. I mean, I think there are two observables that became fairly sort of evident to people looking at Sweden. First, we did not introduce any curfews or lockdowns of that sort, and we didn't close down schools. I think when we went a few months further in time, I don't think many countries did close down their schools. So I mean, to some extent, our policy measures did become more built on legal measures, and then other countries sort of converged with regard to at least the educational system. And I think that when we didn't close down schools, that's also really a public health issue, because our public health experts see fairly negative consequences of closing down schools. And I mean, I could only agree as an economist. We all know that our future productive potential will rely heavily on the amount of education that we're able to give our kids. So public health in a wider sense and economic analysis actually come closer to each other once you start thinking about it.
I think that's a reasonable assessment. There is a risk, right, that decision makers are a bit siloed and they don't think about the broader implications of their decisions. And they, if you're focused on fighting disease, you ultimately want to, be much more restrictive than if you take that broader societal view. I think that's a reasonable way to think about it. Yeah.
So thanks. And then I'm thinking about maybe moving on to more of my home turf. That is what we've been doing to bridge the crisis.
That's right. Because that was part of the story, right? So how has the Swedish economy done under all this? What's in macro terms, how have things gone over the past year or so?
Well, first, if we look at policy, I mean, when the crisis hit, I think we decided pretty early that it was essential to bridge the immediate crisis. Therefore, we undertook, with Swedish terms, fairly unprecedented discretionary measures. They amounted to some 4 or 5% of GDP, and then we had liquidity support and the like for approximately the same number. Now, in a US context, or as compared to the US, these are not huge numbers. It's actually much less than what has been employed in the US. However, one should bear in mind that, I mean, in Sweden, we have fairly large existing automatic stabilizers. For instance, we have a relatively generous unemployment scheme that always kicks in once unemployment starts growing. So one should never disregard the fact that we have institutions that cater for crisis from the start, and we are not as relying on discretionary measures. But having said that, I mean, extraordinary discretionary measures have been put to use. And I think the most important program quantitatively in terms of providing support for firms and workers in Sweden has been short-term work. So firms that have suffered temporary and serious financial difficulties during COVID-19 have received government support up to like 75% of the cost, when reducing an employee's work hours up to 80%. And then the remaining 25% have been split between the worker and the firm. So,
so for background for our audience, so these programs exist to some extent in the US, but they're barely used, and it's really a much more targeted approach than what we've seen here, right? Where the US has really showered all of its businesses with cash without really focusing on businesses that saw particular revenue losses the way, or that saw a reduction in their demand for labor the way Sweden did. I think that sets the size of the program in perspective too.
Yeah. Well, to set it in some sort of frame, during last year, about 12% of workers were on short-term work. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's not very limited, but it's also not.
Sure. I'm saying, but it's targeted at that 12%. It's not targeted at the other 88% of workers. Yeah.
That's true. Now, but at least for Sweden, this is the first time that we have employed a short-term work scheme like this. In other European countries, like Germany, for instance, this is an established institution. But we chose to enter into this short-term work scheme because, I mean, from the policymakers' point of view, we thought that it would be more efficient to maintain these matches in the labor market rather than to go through a process of destructing jobs and then letting job creation work. We figured that would have been a more costly venture for society. And I think, and this is obviously depends on how long you think the crisis will last. But if the crisis is limited in time, I think the intuition holds. And then another big program that we have had is what we call the reorientation support scheme. But this is a financial allowance offered to companies that suffer a significant decline in turnover. And this limit has been between 30 and 40%, depending on which month during the last year. And then this subsidy covers fixed costs. So the company experiences a large drop in turnover, and then the subsidy covers fixed cost. Also here, it's a large fraction, up to 90% of fixed costs. And also here, it was actually 12% of Swedish firms that were eligible for this kind of support. And this also accrues to many smaller businesses rather than the large one that also had access to the short-term work scheme. But out and above that, these are maybe in a US context more targeted measures. I'm not sort of 100% aware of the US policy.
No, so they are, but in part because it's difficult, I think, for the US, certainly at the federal level, to implement more targeted programs, right? So on the unemployment side, a good illustration of how tight the constraints were and how difficult it would be to do something like a short work program along the lines of what you just laid out, to illustrate how difficult that would be at the federal level. Here, a big constraint for policymakers has been that it was very difficult and for all practical purposes impossible to target, to make increases in unemployment benefits depend on previous wages. Right. So even like the replacement rate was not even a variable that we could use to fine tune policy. Right. So that in that sense, it's really a different world, a different universe in terms of the feasibility of targeting. And so that's why I wanted to highlight that for folks.
No, and I can assure you that as a policymaker, it's quite a good cushion to have a solid unemployment insurance once the crisis hits. So I mean that I think is a conclusion that could be drawn for many countries. It helps, but then I mean we obviously had to employ more measures in order to bridge this crisis. So out and above these firm supports, we've also had some tax deferrals. These are aimed at the whole all enterprises. We have compensated on employers for higher sick pay costs if this has been the case, and also we temporarily reduced social security contributions. But these are broad measures. They're quantitatively important, but not as important as the first ones that I mentioned. I think if you sort of sum up the result of these, they have been essential in cushioning the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. I think what we've seen is that unemployment did increase in Sweden by about 2 percentage points. If you look at bankruptcies, they've actually fallen somewhat. And
yeah, that's the case here too. And so you must be worried about what's going to happen once the support programs disappear.
I think that it's obviously not evident that a decline in bankruptcies in a deep crisis is the optimal solution if creative destruction is part of the growth process. So there's probably a backlog of transformation here in store for us. Now, I think that still on the bridging of the crisis, I would not say, I mean, we've not been fully successful. What we do know is that the increased unemployment and also the inactivity that comes with a short-term work scheme will have lasting effect on human capital. So I think it will have some permanent or some.
Because that's an important question, right? Because it really matters it really matters how you think about the value of the matches between firms and workers, whether it's whether it's going to the workplace every day or whether it's simply that you found each other that matters. And so I guess that it'll be a good test of which one of those theories is true, right? Whether it's about surge cost in the labor market or it is about firm specific human capital, which you would expect to deteriorate to some extent if you're working less.
I suppose that could be an empirical question that we are yet to learn, but I think it's a bit of both. But I think sort of the ideal short-term scheme would use the time that you free up for productive purposes in education. But we were not able to establish a system like that on the scale that we're talking on during the past year. But I think that if this is to be a more lasting institution, one should really look into how to make the best use of the time that people are paid for but not working, to see how they could develop their skills in order to come out stronger of the crisis. But we were unable. I mean,
that really must be easier with 1% of the labor force than 10% of the labor force.
Yeah.
So on the business support side, the program you highlighted, you call the reorientation subsidy or grant, or can you talk about that a little bit more? What was the goal there, to just help companies in the hardest hit industries make it through, or what was the design of that program?
No. The design of that particular program was that to be eligible, you had to suffer a drop in turnover. And then obviously the idea is that this was a unique and in time limited crisis, so that maybe the firm was viable even though turnover dropped. And I think that I mean, in retrospect, this support has gone to a large extent to companies within tourism, restaurants, those kind of industries that have been very hit by the crisis. So I think the intuition is that the company as such is viable, but it's unfortunate in the time of crisis. Now, obviously, this remains to be seen, and as stated, we've had less bankruptcies than I would have expected. So some of these companies we probably will have maintained, even though they wouldn't have been healthy without sort of or under normal circumstances. But this will have to look through now in the coming year or so. So I think where we're at today, starting with the pandemic situation, I mean, the infection rates are now dropping quite fast in Sweden, even though we're still at a high rate. I think that we're foreseeing that the summer will be even better in terms of the pandemic. And also our vaccination are progressively at very much the same speed as the rest of Europe. So I think almost half of the population above 18 have now had their first shot. So now we're really looking towards the end of the pandemic, and we really have to think more about what is a reasonable policy under those circumstances. And obviously these bridging policies that we have talked about, the short-term work scheme and also the reorientation support, we have to end them as the economic situation becomes.
And so the reorientation schemes are still ongoing. Those are monthly subsidies. How does that work?
Well, you apply on monthly data, but I think that if you talk to many Swedish firms, they wouldn't experience the support as monthly, seeing that the administration of it has taken some time and on some instances. So, but they're based on monthly turnover data. Yes, but I'm not sure with regard to the payments.
So to clarify this for our viewers, so the program that this sounds most similar to in the U.S. is the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided money to pretty much all small and medium-sized businesses, and so and that money you could use for payroll and for fixed costs to some extent, but largely for payrolls, right? So here we're talking about a program that is targeted based on revenue losses, which the U.S. wasn't capable of doing. I know the Netherlands, for example, did this as well. It's just you just need to be set up for it a bit more than the U.S. was, I think. And the PPP program also covered a lot of payroll in addition to fixed costs, and so that I think for political purposes that makes it a bit more palatable for voters here. But obviously, it makes sense to target fixed costs because that's the part of your cost structure that's hardest to reduce when you're suddenly hit by a negative shock. But go ahead. Yeah. So how do you think about going back to normal? What's the path forward?
Well, first of all, I mean, starting in the pandemic, as the pandemic situation gets normal, then obviously the government has no need for restrictions or recommendations in order to limit activity, because the health risk is at that point in time history. And then obviously we need another set of economic policy interventions. So I think when we're now looking up towards the budget bill of this autumn and measures at that point in time, we're looking much more at more traditional fiscal policy stimulus. We're still under potential with regard to GDP, so there is still quite a strong motive for fiscal stimulus. And also,
are you going to mail out checks to everyone like the federal government here does, or do you have something more sophisticated in mind?
Well, I don't think Sweden has ever mailed out checks like the American government, and it may not be the first candidate that we would look into, but it's an interesting policy proposal, I suppose. No, I think that when it comes to more traditional fiscal stimulus, first and foremost in Sweden is always to make sure that municipalities have their money to keep schools, healthcare, etc. going. I mean that's really the bread and butter. Second, to make sure that households can demand new goods and services. I mean, and in aggregate demand. We did start some of these measures already last autumn. But at that point in time, we were unaware of both the second and the third waves of the pandemic. So the timing of that operation was probably less than optimal. But they're still in place, which means that we expect to see households having a bit of leeway once they are allowed to start consuming in a more normal manner. I think that I think that in the autumn we will probably employ more traditional fiscal stimulus in the budget, but this is only the sort of starting point of the Swedish pandemic policy. I think in a European context, what is more unique about the Swedish fiscal situation is that our public debt is about 40% of GDP. And this stems from a history since the early 90s when we had a financial crisis where we instituted a strong fiscal policy framework that has strong public support. So when I talk about fiscal stimulus, this will be the case in this year, the next year, maybe some the year after that. But then we have to demonstrate a very clear way back to the surplus target that we have. So in Sweden, we have a surplus target for public finances. And if there is not a crisis, we really have the aim to adhere to that surplus target.
And that really is a very different approach from, by now, practically all other countries, right? So obviously the US has deficits planned out for as far as the eye can see, but within the European Union too, I think 40% is really, far below the median for EU member states. And I think even in the medium term, there aren't that many countries that will end up running surpluses.
There may be a handful. But we surely are aiming at going back to surpluses when the time is ripe. I mean, right now we think it's important for the recovery to gain solid momentum. But having said that, we will present a plan as to how we're going to return to the surplus target, and I think we'll present that plan in the autumn sometime. So there will be fiscal support in the nearer future, but in the medium term, there will certainly be a plan to back to the surplus that we're used to. And I think also in Sweden, there is from time to time a debate whether or not we are not being too prudent with our fiscal policy and too fiscally conservative. But I think that all Swedes have been very satisfied that we've been able to employ large stimulus in this crisis, and the fundamental reason for our liberty in doing so has been the low debt. I mean that's the fundament of our crisis policy. So as we move back to a normal economic situation, we will also move back to preparing for the next crisis, i.e. having surpluses and seeing the public debt shrink somewhat as compared to GDP.
How do you think about this sort of more broadly within the union, within the European Union, where obviously for now the budget rules have been waived, presumably temporarily. when do you think that will start returning to normal? What's the Swedish position there? I assume Sweden would like for the other member states to also return to smaller deficits, if not surpluses, on a somewhat reasonable timeline.
Yes, I think. Well, what I said for Sweden should be true for Europe also. I mean, we shall not abolish our support before we feel that our economies stand on solid ground and that we have a good momentum in the recovery. But at that point in time, we certainly have to return to the fiscal policy rules that we have in Europe, and we will obviously return to our Swedish fiscal policy rules. When that is in time, I mean, that is yet to be seen, but it's not more than 2 or 3 years away, I wouldn't say, and we are proponents of having fiscal rules in Europe, but I think that sometimes these discussions cover more the rules and how they are constructed rather than how countries adhere to their rules. And I think our experience is that the rules are never better than your sort of capacity to follow them. So I mean, I think sometimes economists spend a lot of time thinking about the optimal set of rules, but then you end up with the country not following the rules anyway. I'm fairly open as to how the rules should look, but I think that a lot more energy has to go into following the rules once they are in place. And with regard to the European rules, we think they're perfectly fine. We should return to them as soon as the economic circumstances allow.
It is true that they have grown increasingly more complicated especially over the past 5 to 10 years. And now there's a web of terminology that I think, certainly if you believe that ultimately voters have to hold politicians to account for following those rules, I think we've overdone it a little bit on the complexity side. And, maybe it's...
This may very well be the case. However, one should note that the Swedish public sentiment is that policymakers that appear as though they have good order in their public finances, they gain popularity. So we're a Nordic country in that sense. I think this is a fairly popular belief, and hence it's not a huge problem. If the voters are uninterested in looking at how fiscal policy adds up, then politicians have a more difficult task. The Swedish views, I think, stem from our experience in the 90s. We had a very tough time in the 90s with high unemployment, and we saw large cuts in our welfare state. And I think it's a fairly common notion that we don't want to experience that again. So if you want to protect your welfare state, then you better keep your public finances in order. And I think that pretty much sums up the majority position in Sweden right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a sensible way to think about that. I think, creating a web of, convergence tracks and medium-term objectives and those kinds of, I don't know that those are as enforceable by voters as that bigger picture approach that you sketch out would be. So part of what the European Union has done over the past year in order to, I suppose, help the member states that do not have the kind of fiscal space that Sweden has or that Germany or the Netherlands have, has been to create a European recovery and resilience facility, which will provide member states with with loans and grants to fund the recovery and do industrial policy, build infrastructure, those kinds of things. How does that fit into your plans moving forward, into your budget? I know Sweden has not been the most outspoken supporter of this facility. Can you talk about how that is going?
We've certainly not been an outspoken supporter of the facility. We were outspoken against the facility for a long period. So I think that there was maybe an intuition that you needed to create fiscal space for some member states. And we were proponents of allowing them to borrow money from the union. I mean, so that the union would borrow money and lend it to states that were interested. That we felt was a reasonable scheme. Now we were a minority in this view, and as we agreed on the recovery facility in the summer, for us it was. Obviously, the importance of our membership in the European Union, that was the most important reason to actually cope or to approve of this scheme, because most other countries wanted a facility like this. So I think that for Sweden, as a fairly small and also a hugely trade-dependent country, the value of the membership in the European Union is hard to overstate. It's probably much larger than whichever payment that accrued to this facility. But we didn't think it was a great idea. But now that it is in place, obviously it is an important chance to do something good. So we hope that the facility will spur better long-term growth in the countries that gain more resources, and also contribute to more sustainable public finances in these countries, because that's important for us. And to the extent that we've taken part of the plans and our interactions with the Commission, I think it looks. We're somewhat hopeful. We hope that this comes out in a good way now, and then during the summer, obviously, all countries' plans will be gone through by the Commission and also will be approved by the ministerial countries should the Council decide this. So we weren't too keen on the idea to start with, and we're still not keen on the idea. But once the facility is in place, we obviously aim at making the best of it. You should remember that Sweden is not part of the Eurozone, and a facility like this maybe is more relevant in the Eurozone. But for us, it's. We really appreciate our membership in the union, and we appreciate all the benefits that we get from that. So from time to time, you have to accept something that you're not. This facility, this once, we still consider it a temporary measure that was spurred by an unprecedented crisis, and we have no intention of making such efforts again.
I see. So for viewers who are interested in learning what one of these recovery plans looks like, I did a webinar last week with Thomas Dermine about the Belgian recovery plan, where we went into some of the more nitty-gritty detail of where are we going to put the train lines and that kind of stuff. And so I would recommend that. So part of the plans, and I think this is relatively new, is that there is some notion of conditionality and demand for reforms to be carried out. Are you optimistic that those will make a meaningful difference in the sort of future productivity of the member states, or do you think that?
At this point in time, I am optimistic, but I'm really not aware of the nitty-gritty details of all these plans. If you look at the Swedish plan that the government decided on today, it's quite a small thing as compared to all the policy measures that we just talked about.
Yeah.
So,
and it's small in part because Sweden is just less of a beneficiary of the facility than a country like Italy or something.
This is the case. So countries that are better off economically and weren't as hard hit by the economic crisis receive less, obviously. And with this, in Swedish terms, I could say that the recovery facility will give us an amount of money that is about 1/12 or so of what we spent on extraordinary measures to meet the crisis. But obviously, when we designed our policy during last year, we were aware of these resources coming from the union, and they've been a useful source of financing for all the measures that we've taken.
And to what extent? So, because the recovery facility has sort of broad areas of focus. To what extent has your own domestic policymaking been shifted a bit toward some of these union priorities, or you say it kind of fits in nicely? It's a financing thing, and it's all mostly pre-existing priorities.
The two priorities that the union have flagged the most is digitalization and green recovery. And Sweden is one of the world's most digitalized countries, and we've been working on climate issues for decades. So I think that this may have had more of an impact in other countries when you look at sort of the direction of the policy, and also quantitatively. It's not a huge thing in Sweden, but it's a useful contribution, and I think it will be constructive for Sweden once we're up and running with that plan.
Excellent. I think we're about through the topics that I wanted to discuss today. On digitalization, there's a lot of interest now in the US for investments in rural broadband and things like that. Sweden is, from my perspective as a Dutchman, Sweden is an enormous country with large rural areas. Is that an area of focus or concern for the Swedish government too, or is that mostly something
absolutely.
that's been addressed? Yeah.
No, absolutely, and this will be part of the recovery plan, the digitalization leg of it. I mean, Sweden is, with European terms, a vast country, but maybe not with American terms. I'm not aware of the size of our area as compared to any U.S. state, but I'm sure there's Google.
Exactly.
But let's put it like this: we have a population of 10 million, and our area is larger than Germany. So this means that we're mostly sparsely populated, and then obviously we need public interventions in order to cover. With broadband, the larger part or a large part of the country, which is very sparsely populated, and we do it. I mean, subsidize that because we think it's a priority that all Swedes, regardless of where they live, should have reasonable access to a digital infrastructure, and this progressively becomes more and more important, obviously. So we have for some years, and we will carry on doing that, subsidized the extension of the broadband net to cover more and more of our sparsely populated areas. And I think that this could obviously be the case in some US states that are similar. And I think it's well worth thinking about, because there are benefits to these areas being covered by broadband, and it does increase the growth potentials or potential of such locations.
So looking forward, say a year or 2 years from now, what will you be looking at to see whether the emergency policies of the past year and a half have been successful? What are sort of metrics that you'll be curious to see?
Well, I mean, I'm a Swedish social democrat, and we will be looking at employment and unemployment. These are our genes, so to speak. We believe that people fare well from working, but we also believe that it's really the way to individual freedom that you can support yourself. So we'll be looking at both employment and unemployment, and currently employment is comparably high and hasn't dropped much during the crisis. Unemployment has increased. So what we have seen is actually that our labor force, I think, is fairly intact during the crisis, and that's I think. It's unfortunate that unemployment is going up, but to the extent that it happens without the number of jobs going down, it's sort of a less of a problem for the economy. For the individual, unemployment is always a problem. So I think that the focus for this government, looking forward 1 year, 2 years, is to increase employment and to decrease unemployment, and obviously we need to use all the traditional tools. I mean, retraining, education that we use to a larger extent than we've used them before. But I think in addition to that, and in the autumn, we're also gonna need some public demand stimulus in order to get the economy back on track. So those would be the metrics that we will focus on: employment and unemployment.
And a forecast, when is the Swedish economy going to be 5% bigger than it was in 2019? Is that going to happen anytime soon?
Oh, I wish I could answer that.
Forecasting is very difficult.
I would say end 2023 or so.
Okay. My colleague James Pethokoukis likes to say that the golden rule of economic punditry is you give a number or a date, never both at the same time. Anyway,
I think that our forecast now is that towards the end of this year we're going to be on sort of on the same level as pre-pandemic, but then obviously we're going to need some time to get back on track. So another year or two before.
That is quite good, right? That is really quite a bit better, I think, than people expected in April 2020, when I think forecasts looked significantly more negative.
This is much better than I would have guessed a year ago, and that's very positive. But still, there is work to be done.
Well, on that note, I will let you return to that work. I want to thank our audience for tuning in. Thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thank you.